Hey, podcast friends. This is Dr. Steve Hewlett with the podcast Simple Healthy Choices for Weight Loss, where every week we help people who have realized that as their health has been declining over the years, the number of medications that are being prescribed is increasing. We want to help you reverse this health path so you can live the vibrant, pain-free, and hopefully medication-free life you deserve to live. And as a special bonus, due to the fact that sugar addiction is affecting more and more people every year and is directly causing devastatingly poor health consequences, I am one of over 40 specialists being interviewed on the free online Quit Sugar Summit this year. If any of you feel you are suffering from the very real and growing issue of sugar addiction, you can go to our website, drstevehewlett.com, and click on the Sugar Summit link at the top of the page to enroll in this free online Quit Sugar Summit that will be aired on January 6th to January 12th. Hey, welcome back, podcast friends. Now, today, I really want to talk to you about sugar and how sugar is horrible for your health. So most of our past videos, I'll talk about this. So I just kind of wanted to summarize everything I've said in the past. So it's hopefully it's very, very clear to you why this is. And basically how the nutrition science is way different than medical science. Medical science is trying to sell you things. The food companies, the drug companies, they want your money. Nutrition science is the exact opposite of what they are. And so this is what we find out. Nutrition science tells us what causes the diseases in the very first place and how you can take care of it. To our medical sciences, all they tell you is how to treat it, what drugs you want to use to treat what symptom of disease. So I want you to understand the basis of exactly what causes the diseases that we have. So basically, when you think of disease, there's three main pillars of disease that's causing all of our disease. That's high insulin levels, and that's inflammation all throughout our body. And when you have both of those, then all of a sudden, after you've had that for 20, 30 years of just constantly high insulin levels, you end up with insulin resistance. And once you end up with insulin resistance, that means your body doesn't respond to insulin anymore. And so now your glucose levels increase. So you have high insulin levels, inflammation throughout the body, and high blood glucose levels. And those three things is what's killing us. That is the basis of almost every single organ damage thing that you see today. And there is kind of a fourth pillar also, which is fructose. And fructose is extremely toxic. And if you really want to watch a good YouTube video, there's one by Dr. Robert Lustig. It's called Sugar, the Bitter Truth. And this thing, Dr. Lustig was actually talking to his biochemistry class, but because of this video has gone viral. It's got, I don't even know how many millions of views that this thing has right now. And it's a biochemistry class. That means he speaks to it in lower language that everybody can understand. And I just mean lower, something that's not medical language, so everybody can understand how horrible this is. So I'll talk about it in just a little bit, but not as much as what Dr. Robert Lustig did in his video, Sugar, the Bitter Truth. So first thing that I want you to realize is there's only one substance that has a direct link to obesity. When this substance is high, it forces you to store fat. You cannot burn your fat for energy. When this substance is low, it forces you to burn your own fat. You can't store it. So obviously, if you are having trouble with obesity and type 2 diabetes and blood pressure and all these other things, the key is to keep this substance low. And I know you already know what this is, but for those of you who haven't been following me, that substance is insulin. High insulin forces you to store fat. Low insulin forces you to actually burn your own fat. And I talked all about this, explained exactly why that is in episode number 34 on what determines whether you store fat or if you burn fat for energy. So I highly recommend you getting that because I think this is the eye-opener, and this is actually the basis of all the conditions we're seeing now. But one of the main reasons why this is because of all the blood vessel damage that high insulin, inflammation, and high glucose does to our bodies. And this kind of all started when I first learned about this. And how horrible just insulin by itself, all the damage that it does to the organs in our body. And there's a great book called Why We Get Sick. And that's by Dr. Ben Bickman. And Dr. Ben Bickman, he's a metabolism specialist at Brigham Young University, BYU. And his whole life, all he does, he's a professor there, but he also, that's what he studies in his lab, is he studies insulin and its effect on different tissues in the body. So this book is wonderful and explains to you why insulin is the basis of everything, of why we get sick. So the main thing that happens, okay, and I'm just going to break it down, and I've talked about this in the past, but the main thing that happens is when you have high insulin levels and you have high inflammation and you have high blood glucose, this starts tearing up all the small blood vessels in your body. Okay, it starts tearing them up. And I've explained why this is in past episodes, but just go with this. It tears up the small blood vessels. When you tear up the small blood vessels in the body, then the organs that those attach to, those become severely damaged. And this is why when you have diabetes, the triad of diabetes is retinopathy, which is eye problems, nephropathy, which is nerve problems, or a nephropathy, which is kidney problems, and neuropathy, which is the nerve system, breaking down the nerves. And this is why people they lose their feeling in their legs. And that's why you have to have amputations and all this. But those are the main triads. So nephropathy, neuropathy, and retinopathy. However, when you start damaging the larger blood vessels, now you start damaging all the organs. And this is when you get everything. This is when you get kidney disease. Number one reason for people to be on dialysis is because of having type 2 diabetes. And I'll talk about that in a little bit too. But you get kidney disease, get liver disease, starting off with fatty liver disease, which we never used to see before except for in alcoholics. And now by far the majority is liver disease that's caused by high glucose and diabetes. So kidney disease, liver disease, atherosclerosis, which is the hardening of the arteries, high blood pressure, heart disease, all the cardiovascular disease that they're telling you is caused by high LDL levels, which makes no sense. And that also is a lie. But this is what it's caused from, is the damage of all the blood vessels that's affecting the heart. So you have heart disease, strokes, peripheral vascular disease, infections. It causes infections, skin and nail problems, erectile dysfunction, cancer, polycystic ovarian disease. PCOS, polycystic ovarian disease, is one of the major reasons why women can't get pregnant nowadays. And this is due to keeping high insulin levels that causes cysts to grow on the ovaries. And then there's dementia and Alzheimer's, because this glucose also, when you keep your insulin levels high and your glucose levels high, you start damaging on the nerves in the brain as well. So all these Alzheimer's and dementia and all these things that I just now told you about, look up any of them. When did these actually really start becoming bad? They were creeping up through the early 1900s, just a little bit, not much. But once it hits right around the 1970s, 1980s, that's when all of these just skyrocketed. And it's all for this exact same reason. So what is the basis of all this all this organ damage? It is exactly what we said. It's high glucose, inflammation, and high insulin levels. And then also throw the fructose in there. So just as one example, talking about the increased blood pressure. And again, I did a whole podcast on this, episode 12, on how carbohydrates increase blood pressure. But one thing you really need to know about is high insulin levels cause you to have high aldosterone levels. Aldosterone is a hormone in your body that's called the antidiuretic hormone. It's antidiuretic because what it does is it keeps the sodium in your blood. So as sodium gets excreted out through the kidneys, usually that just pulls water out and you just pee it out. But when you have high aldosterone levels, you keep that sodium in, and that's what normally helps regulate your blood pressure. But if you have high insulin levels, so you have high aldosterone levels, you are constantly keeping that sodium in your body, and so your blood pressure gets higher and higher. So the key to all this is keep your insulin levels low, and that'll actually make you pee off all that fluid. So that'll decrease your blood pressure. It will also decrease the edema. A lot of people have walking around with a lot of edema in their legs, and it's because they continue to eat this kind of stuff that keeps your aldosterone levels high. When you decrease your insulin levels, then you're going to be able to pee that off, and that's going to help with your edema. And a lot of patients have edema because of all of this. So there's so many diseases that can actually be cured, totally reversed and cured if you just change what you put in your mouth. And this also, there's a whole thing, there's a direct way of how this actually causes hardening of the arteries also. Not just the fact that you're keeping your aldosterone levels and keeping the fluid in your body, but the actual deterioration of the blood vessels themselves. So, and just like I've talked about in the last few episodes, I've talked about in episode 108, as far as the fat facts, why is cholesterol vital to our health? Episode 109, the fat facts, why is fat vital to our health? And then episode 110, talking about why does eating too many carbohydrates cause heart attacks? So if you want to watch 108, 109, and 110, that will explain this in depth of what I'm saying right now. So that's why it sounds like I'm just skimming over, but I go in depth on those so you understand exactly what's going on. But the main thing, what's going on, is our bodies love homeostasis. It wants to keep everything the same as much as possible. So when we start getting too much of one thing, our body's going to kind of back off and say, no, I don't want that right now. And that's what, like insulin resistance. Increased insulin is caused by increased blood glucose. Increased blood glucose is caused by eating plant-based food, which is carbohydrates, which all has the basic building block of glucose. So when you eat carbohydrates day in, day out, year after year, decades after decades, because your insulin keep that glucose down for a little bit, but all of a sudden it takes more and more and more insulin to keep that blood glucose down. So when you're having more and more blood glucose, or because of eating all these carbohydrates, you have more and more insulin being produced for over 10, 20, 30 years. When you have that much high insulin levels, your body starts becoming resistant to it. It actually has receptors on it that the insulin will attach to, and that's what allows the glucose to go in the cells. Well, these cells, if you have insulin too high for too long, it starts decreasing all these receptor sites. So it takes more and more insulin to get that same effect, to where eventually, after you've been bombarding your body with glucose because of all those carbohydrates for decades, now all of a sudden your body is resistant to the insulin, and now you see the glucose come up. So by the time you go to the doctor and he says, oh, you've got high blood glucose, you have diabetes, you have had diabetes for the last 10, 20, 30 years, because diabetes is insulin resistance, and we don't test insulin. You can. That's very, very cheap and very easy. My wife just did it. It only cost $35 to get her fasting insulin tested. And we didn't need a doctor to do it. You can do it through a lab. But what you want to do is you want to make sure to keep that insulin levels down. If you keep them up all the time, and since we don't look at it, we have no idea that you've been insulin resistant all this time. All we know is once you get insulin resistant, now your blood glucose goes up. When your blood glucose goes up and you have type 2 diabetes, you are definitely late in the game. You already have a lot of damage going in your body because of all the damage that insulin does to your body directly from insulin. But now when you raise the glucose and you raise the inflammation, this is when people start falling apart. They've been doing the same thing for 20, 30 years, and now their bodies are just going to pieces. All their organs are becoming damaged. They're lethargic. They're sick all the time. And they act like, oh, this just happened. It just happened. You became diabetic one day, and that is not how it happens. So what you need to do is do not wait till your blood glucose levels go up. If you know that you eat a lot of carbohydrates, which most people do, most people are addicted to carbohydrates, you're guaranteed you are going to become diabetic. And that's another thing. Diabetes, people act like with all this organ damage, that I just talked about, the heart disease, strokes, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, high blood pressure, all that. Those are individual little diseases, all caused by the same thing. But the big umbrella that encompasses all that is diabetes. So diabetes isn't just another disease. It's just like a liver disease or kidney disease or Alzheimer's disease. Diabetes is an overall thing saying now you have high insulin, high glucose, and inflammation, and now we are going to kill all the organs in your body. That's what diabetes is. This is no little thing. This is huge, and that's type 2 diabetes. So the other thing, just like we said, if you have too much insulin, you get insulin resistance. Your body decrease the amount of receptors that insulin can affect. Same thing we've already talked about in the last episode with leptin resistance. Remember, leptin is the hormone that stimulates the hypothalamus to make it to where you're not hungry anymore. But when you constantly are bombarding your body with this glucose and this insulin, what ends up happening is you get obese. And when you get obese, all these fat cells, which produce insulin, you have so many fat cells producing insulin that now your body becomes resistant to the leptin. And once it's resistant to the leptin, that means that you're going to be hungry all the time, because now your satiety center is resistant because of what we've done to it with all this fat storage because of high insulin levels. There's another organ that does the same thing, and it's your pleasure center. The pleasure center in your brain, the nucleus accumbens, does the same thing. When you continue to bombard your pleasure center with pleasures like sugar, they found that sugar affects the nucleus accumbens the same way that cocaine does. So at first it takes a little bit to give you that pleasure, but eventually you start getting resistant. It takes more and more to give you that pleasure. And when that happens, then now all of a sudden you start becoming resistant to all pleasures. And they think that this may have a lot to do with why we see a lot of depression days also, besides the nerve damage in the brain, but you also are overwhelming your pleasure center, the nucleus accumbens, because you're eating sugar all the time. Okay. So these are the things that we want you to understand. And again, this was not something that just happened overnight. All of a sudden you're doing fine. Now all of a sudden, oh, look, my blood sugar's high. This is because you've had insulin levels high for way too long. And then all of a sudden, high blood sugar is a symptom of type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is insulin resistant, caused by continuously keeping your insulin levels high day after day, week after week, year after year, decades after decades. So, but it can be reversed if you just stop stimulating your insulin levels. So what does glucose actually do to your body? Okay. Again, it causes your insulin levels go high. And this is what ends up causing type 2 diabetes. But glucose itself, glucose binds to proteins in your body, and it's called glycation. And this is not a good thing. When you bind glucose to the proteins in your body, that makes those proteins that damages them. This is the same way we talked about in past episodes, how you glycate your small, dense LDLs. And remember, it's not high LDLs that cause cardiovascular disease. That's not true. There are good LDLs and there are bad LDLs. And the bad LDLs are small, dense LDLs, to where the good ones are large, buoyant. And these small, dense LDLs, they get glycated. Glucose attaches to them. And that's what I've talked about in these I explained all that in the episodes that I just told you about. Episodes 108, 109, and 110 will explain all about that. But anytime you get high glucose, it binds to the protein and it deteriorates it. And this is what your A1C is. If any of you, which I'm sure most of you know what A1C is, that's when you go to the doctor and they say, oh, your A1C is 5.7 to 6.4. So you're in pre-diabetes, which that's pre-diabetes is a term that was made up also. And I've done episodes on that as well. But what that means is you have been keeping your glucose high so long, it starts attaching to the proteins in your red blood cells. And it starts damaging those red blood cells. And the longer your glucose is high, the more glucose attaches to the red blood cells. And that's what your A1C is. Red blood cells only last about 3-4 months. And so that's why it can only test how high your blood glucose has been for the last, 3 months. And usually it's really more indicative of the last month. But A1C is glucose damaging the red blood cells by glycating the protein. That same thing happens to every single blood vessel in your body, every single organ in your body. All this high glucose attaches and glycates these proteins, and it damages them. So that's another reason why you want to keep your blood glucose levels low. The other thing, when you have high blood glucose, and again, this causes high insulin, when you are eating carbohydrates all the time, like most people do, one thing, this also causes your body to lack nutrients. Okay. Because if you're eating all these carbohydrates, you're not leaving much room. So carbohydrates, these are the toxic, might as well say, these are the toxic nutrients that you're going to have because they're all based on glucose. But when you fill your stomach up with all these carbohydrates, you leave very little room for the good, healthy animal protein, fat and cholesterol, vitamins, and minerals. And we've talked about that. Those are the four things. And then you can add water for a fifth. But the four things that you have to eat for proper nutrition: you have to eat protein, you have to eat fat and cholesterol, you have to have vitamins, and you have to have minerals. And when you eat all these carbohydrates, especially man-made carbohydrates that have none of that, it has no fat cholesterol because it can't stay on the shelf very long. It'll go bad on you. It has no animal protein. All they use is vegetable or plant proteins in there, which we are animals. We're not plants. So when we eat animals, we get the full complement of all the amino acids we need. When you eat plants, you get some of the amino acids, but there's some you don't. You get some vitamins and minerals, not very many, and you have to eat a ton of plants to get the amount of vitamins and minerals that you're going to get like out of a good, healthy steak. You're going to get all the vitamins and all the minerals you need in a very small amount. So these are other things that happen that when you have high blood glucose and it makes you hungry all the time, you're constantly hungry. The other thing, when you eat glucose all the time and you have high insulin levels all the time, it forces you to turn all that glucose that your body isn't needing, which is a lot. And we talked about in the last episode, our whole intravascular blood volume is only 2 teaspoons of sugar. And that's about what we used to eat back in the 1960s. And now it's estimated we eat over 65 teaspoons of sugar per person per day now. So we have a ton of this glucose. So we have a ton of glucose being turned into fat in the form of triglycerides. And since your high insulin levels tells your liver to convert that glucose into triglycerides, and then high insulin levels tells your body to store all that fat, all that triglycerides in your fat cells. Okay. I know I keep saying the same thing over and over and over again, but I really want you to understand how important this is and how simple, maybe not easy, but how simple the solution is to your weight gain, your organ damage, your quality of life, your dementia, everything. So that's what glucose is. That's how glucose can damage all the proteins in your body. The other one, remember we said that the 3 pillars was high insulin and inflammation. And when you have high inflammation and high insulin for decades, eventually you wear out and your body is going to start, it becomes insulin resistant, and now your glucose levels go up. So that was the third one, is the high glucose levels. The fourth pillar is fructose. Fructose is toxic. Fructose is absolutely toxic. And I did a whole podcast just on this at podcast number 6. It's what is fructose and why is it poison? So that'll explain it. But just to sum it up, fructose is toxic because it gets turned, a little bit of fructose gets turned every time you eat. Every single cell in your body can metabolize glucose. Every single cell. Our body knows how to get rid of glucose. Our problem is we eat so much that we overwhelm our body, and that's what causes us to have all the diseases we were just talking about. However, fructose, the only cells that can metabolize fructose are the cells in the liver. And the way it breaks down fructose, one, it can turn it into glucose if it's needed, but most people, low glucose is not a problem. You're eating so many carbohydrates, you have glucose all over in your body. So most of it is not going to be turned into glucose. The other thing that it gets converted into is uric acid. And a lot of people know that uric acid causes gout, but there's a lot more. Uric acid also blocks nitrous oxide, which is produced from your blood vessels to help your blood vessels dilate. Just like when you take nitroglycerin tablets to make your blood vessels dilate, your arteries produce nitric oxide, and that nitric oxide causes your blood vessels to dilate. When you eat fructose, it gets turned into uric acid. Uric acid blocks that nitric oxide, so that can actually make it to where your blood vessels can't dilate, and that increases your high blood pressure, hardening of the arteries, atherosclerosis, and all the organ damage that comes along with that. The other thing that fructose gets turned to is inflammatory mediators. So just the fact that you're eating fructose, you're putting more inflammation into your body. So you're putting a ton of inflammation in your body from the vegetable and seed oils that's in all the man-made food, and you're putting a ton of inflammation in your body because of all the fructose that people eat with sugar and high fructose corn syrup. So you have inflammatory mediators. And then the fourth thing is that fructose, the by far the majority of the metabolites of fructose is triglycerides. So again, this is just another thing. You have glucose that's getting turned into fat, and you have fructose being turned into fat, and you have your high insulin levels that forces you to store that fat. Okay. So this is very, very important. And high fructose corn syrup, people tell you that this is the same as sugar, or say that it's not the same as sugar. It's like, oh, they say high fructose corn syrup is fine because fructose is low on the glycemic index. Of course, it's low on the glycemic index. If you remember, there's three monosaccharides. There's glucose, fructose, and maltose. If you are testing somebody for glucose, like on the glycemic index scale, and you're giving them fructose, of course, fructose is going to be low. That has nothing to do with why fructose is toxic to your body. The other thing they say is fructose doesn't raise your insulin levels. That's true, but that has nothing to do why fructose is toxic to your body. And it's what I just told you. It's how fructose gets metabolized. That's why it's toxic to your body. And they are putting fructose in everything because fructose is in regular table sugar. Remember, that's part glucose, part fructose. And high fructose corn syrup, same thing, only they put even more fructose. One, because that's the sweet part of sugar. It makes you continuously want it, crave it. It gets you addicted to it. So that's why they put it in all the food. So you continue to eat their food. You continue to give them money. You continue to get sick. So now you can give the drug companies money. You don't have to do this. You can avoid all that if you just stop eating all these carbohydrates. So again, now remember glucose, it stimulates insulin. And this insulin is what causes you to store your fat. And when you look at what stimulates insulin and what you eat, when you eat fat, that does not affect your insulin levels at all. Your insulin levels stay low. When you eat protein, it goes up just a little tiny bit. And a lot of that has to do with when you eat meat. Remember, I said that in skeletal muscle, each cell in the skeletal muscle is 1% of glycogen, which is glucose stores. So when you eat meat, you're going to get a little bit of glucose in there, which is going to raise your insulin a little bit, but not much. When you eat carbohydrates, if you eat man-made, or if you eat God-made carbohydrates, real fruit and real vegetables, these can raise your insulin levels up. And it depends on which kind of vegetables. Because with the vegetables, the ones that are under the ground, like potatoes and beets and carrots and all that, those are under the ground. Those are a huge glucose source because it's starch, and that's what feeds the plant. So obviously, if you're going to eat something, if you eat what's underneath the ground, you're eating a lot of glucose because you're eating the storage for the plant. If you eat the plants, the green leafy part that's on top of the ground, that's not going to have as much glucose in it. So it depends on which part you're eating and where you are in your health as far as what you should have. And again, you don't have to eat carbohydrates at all. It is not needed. There are people who live their entire life with nothing but animal products to eat, and they are perfectly healthy and doing perfectly fine. So carbohydrates are not even needed. It's only if you want something. And remember that these all increase hunger. And this is like I've talked about this in the last podcast also, because carbohydrates do not stay in your stomach very long at all. Okay, maybe 30 minutes. And it doesn't stay in your intestines very long, maybe 30 to 60 minutes. Then it immediately gets put into glucose, into the bloodstream, and raises your insulin levels. That starts all this cascade. Also, there's no nutrients in this food. If you eat God-made vegetables, you're going to get a little bit of nutrients. If you eat the man-made products, you're getting no nutrients. They take all the nutrients out in the process while they're putting all these toxic chemicals and insulin and everything else in there. So there's no nutrients. And that's why they like to pat themselves on the back and say, oh, aren't we good, Lou? These are going to be fortified with these vitamins. The reason they have to fortify man-made food with vitamins is because they take it out in the process. So then they take out all these nutrients, and then they just add a few more back, and they pat themselves on the back of, oh, our food's good because it has all these vitamins in it that's been added. So don't fall for their gimmicks. And also remember, obesity, when you're continuously filling your fat cells, remember, fat cells produce leptin. Leptin stimulates the hypothalamus in the brain that tells your body, I'm not hungry, stop eating. But when you keep filling your fat cells constantly, all of a sudden you're producing so much leptin that, again, your hypothalamus it starts becoming resistant to the leptin. So just the fact that you've got so many fat cells, you're producing so much leptin, you get leptin resistance. That's why they say that fat people are not fat because they eat too much. Fat people are fat because, or they eat too much because they're fat. And that's why when you're fat, you get leptin resistance and it makes you hungry all the time. So there's so many different reasons why eating carbohydrates makes you hungry all the time. And usually when you go back to eat, it's usually the same carbohydrates. And that's why people are killing themselves. Basically, that's what's going on. So you have no nutrients that blocks leptin, and the obesity causes leptin resistance. And so in summary, I know I keep saying the same things. In summary, okay, when you eat glucose, this makes you hungrier because there's no nutrient value, gets out of the intestines quick, blocks leptin, and it stimulates insulin. And when you stimulate insulin, insulin causes obesity. That's the only substance that has a direct link to obesity. High insulin causes you to store fat, low insulin causes you to burn fat. And then when you have the high insulin and the high inflammation, now you're going to get type 2 diabetes, which is insulin resistance. And this is going to cause your blood glucose to go high. And that's when the medical system says that you have diabetes, but that is incorrect. That's a symptom. You've been having diabetes for a long time. Sugar, the high glucose, the inflammation, the insulin, and the fructose, all these cause major organ damage because it damages all the blood vessels in your body. The small ones, it's going to start calling the triad, the retinopathy, nephropathy, neuropathy. And when you start damaging the larger ones, it causes all the other diseases that we just talked about. So I know that's a lot of information. I know I repeat it because I really want you to understand this. But that's why I say that the answer, the cure to disease, the actual cure to disease, you can actually reverse a lot of this stuff. If you haven't gone too far in your organ damage, this can be reversed. And I say it's very simple because it is. If you stop all man-made food and even on God-made carbohydrates with real fruits and real vegetables, only eat it seasonally. If it isn't growing in the ground where you live, you should not be eating it. The way you know is go to farmers markets. They'll tell you what they have growing at that time. And I guarantee it's not strawberries and berries in the middle of December. That's not what it is. So what you want to do is very much limit your fruit. As far as your vegetables, it depends on how bad you are. You may want to totally eliminate the fruits or the vegetable that grow underneath the ground and just stick to the ones on top. And if you're not that bad and you just want one every now and then that's when you can have the potatoes and everything. But if you just do that, if you just avoid the carbohydrates and you eat mainly animal products, that's eggs, that's Greek yogurt, that's cottage cheese, that's cream cheese, that's steak or beef or chicken or turkey or fish, all that is perfectly great. That's what we've been living on since the beginning of time. We never had to worry about all this carbohydrates and all that organ damage until recently, until the 1900s. That's when we started seeing all the organ damage that we see right now. So that's why it is simple. Avoid carbohydrates, totally eliminate man-made food, and stick to animal products. However, it's not that easy because they've gotten you addicted to carbohydrates. So you have to break that carbohydrate addiction. And there are ways to do that. And we'll talk about that in a bit also. Well, in another podcast as well. So that's what I've got. That's why the cure for all these diseases, you can actually reverse these diseases, is just keep your insulin levels low, which means keep carbohydrates out of your mouth. And that is the simple truth. So the answer is very simple, but it may not be easy. It depends on how addicted you are. So I hope this helps. I hope you understand this. Always comment. Please comment below. Let us know. Send us emails, however you want to, and let us know if there's anything else that you'd like for us to talk about on our podcast. So for now, as always, have a great week and always make simple, healthy choices to live a quality life. If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button below and be sure to tell someone else who may want to change their health path as well. And remember, if any of you feel you are suffering from the very real and growing issue of sugar addiction, you can go to our website, drstevehewlett.com, and click on the Sugar Summit link at the top of the page to enroll in the free online Quit Sugar Summit that will be aired on January 6th through January 12th.